The invitation wasn't meant to be kind. It was meant to humiliate. In a mansion lit by golden chandeliers and lined with portraits of power, a wealthy woman leaned back in her chair, smirking at her friends. Her maid had been polishing the marble floor, head bowed, trying not to be seen. But tonight, her son was visiting after school, carrying nothing but his worn backpack and quiet dignity. The millionaire noticed him, skin darker than the polished oak around him, clothes patched and simple. She whispered to her guests, "Wouldn't it be funny if he played a round of chess? I hear his mother can't even afford textbooks." Laughter filled the room. It was supposed to be a cruel game, a spectacular failure. But what none of them knew was that this boy carried brilliance in his hands, that behind his silence lived a mind sharper than any blade, a spirit unbroken by wealth, privilege, or the poisonous sting of mockery. What began as a joke would soon become a revelation. His mother, Rosa, had worked in that house for more than 10 years. Every morning she rose before the sun, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake her boy, pulling on the same faded uniform and lacing her shoes with fingers cracked from bleach. By the time the city was stirring, she was already inside the mansion, scrubbing marble steps that gleamed under her knees but never under her name. She dusted chandeliers that hung so high she could barely see them without craning her neck, polished silverware she would never touch at a dinner table, and pressed sheets so smooth they seemed untouched by sleep. She moved like a shadow, unseen and unacknowledged, a presence tolerated only because she was useful. She learned quickly to ignore the whispers, the half smiles that carried contempt, the way her employer said, "the help," as if it wasn't meant for human ears. Rosa kept her head down, because every word unsaid meant another week's pay, another bus ticket, another meal for her son. Dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford. She swallowed the sting, the humiliation, the way they looked through her as if she was furniture. Every dollar mattered. Every hour meant survival. Her son, Malik, grew up with those sacrifices hanging heavy in the air. He was old enough to notice the way his mother's hands shook when she returned home, scrubbing her skin raw as if she could wash off the disrespect that clung to her. He hated the silence she kept inside those walls, hated watching her bow her head when she deserved to stand tall, but he understood. Even as a child, he knew that speaking out, even lifting your eyes at the wrong moment, could cost more than money. It could cost everything. That night, when the millionaire's gaze shifted toward him, Rosa felt a sharp fear dig into her chest. The woman's lips curled with mischief, her voice carrying the kind of command that wasn't meant to be questioned. Rosa recognized the look in her eyes, the cruel anticipation of turning someone else's child into entertainment. Malik was only there because she couldn't afford to leave him at home alone. He carried his worn backpack, his shoes slightly scuffed, his presence already too visible for the comfort of people who only liked children when they were dressed in silk. Rosa's instinct screamed to shield him, to tell them no, to refuse the spectacle before it began. But she couldn't. She felt the weight of her silence pressing against her throat. The job, the paycheck, the roof over their heads, it was all tied to that silence. She looked at her son, forcing a faint smile that betrayed none of her panic, and whispered only 2 words, hoping he would understand. The chessboard was brought out with a kind of theatrical flourish, as though it were part of some performance meant to impress the guests. It wasn't an ordinary board, but one carved from dark mahogany, its edges gilded with gold, each piece gleaming under the chandelier's light like tiny statues. The millionaire's friends leaned forward with glasses of wine, balanced delicately in their hands, their eyes locked on Malik as if he were some novelty about to entertain them. Laughter simmered in their throats, soft but sharp, the kind of laughter that didn't wait for a joke. It created one out of whoever was weakest in the room. "Sit, boy," the woman commanded, her voice clipped as though offering a seat was an act of generosity. Malik obeyed, sliding into the velvet chair. His legs barely reached the floor, his hands resting lightly on the table, small against the grandness of the board. He could feel their eyes pressing into him, not with expectation of greatness, but with hunger for failure. To them, his dark skin, his patched-up shirt, and the faint smell of polish from his mother's work said enough. He wasn't supposed to know strategy. He wasn't supposed to belong here. The millionaire smirked, moving her first pawn forward lazily, more interested in the display than the game itself. Her friends chuckled as though her victory was already certain. Malik's pulse beat against his temples, not from fear but from a heat that burned behind his eyes. He knew exactly what this was. This was no invitation. It was a stage set for his humiliation. They didn't want to see him play. They wanted to see him stumble. But what they couldn't know, what Rosa's silence had hidden for years, was that Malik had already lived inside the squares of a board far older than theirs. At night, while the city slept and his mother scrubbed her hands free of chemicals, Malik sat on the floor of their apartment with a secondhand chessboard missing 2 pawns, his imagination filling the gaps. He studied diagrams torn from library books, memorized openings from borrowed manuals, and traced moves he had seen on flickering screens in community centers. The game had become his refuge, his secret world of order where skill could defeat privilege, where thought mattered more than wealth. He looked at her hand now, slow, callous, dripping with arrogance. Malik's fingers closed around his pawn with quiet certainty. The laughter around him swelled, but he didn't hear it. His mind was already 10 moves ahead, charting the path, measuring the distance between humiliation and dignity. The board was theirs, the wealth was theirs, but the game unfolding in his head belonged to him alone. Piece by piece, the rhythm of the game began to change. At first, the millionaire's friends chuckled each time Malik reached across the board, as though every move he made was a child's guess, a stumble waiting to happen. But soon the sound of their laughter thinned, replaced by the faint clinking of wine glasses being set down, the shuffling of feet as attention sharpened. Malik's eyes never left the board. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost surgical, as though each piece he touched carried the weight of something far larger than a game. The board no longer felt like polished wood. It felt like a battlefield, each square alive with tension. Across from him, the millionaire leaned closer, her smirk slipping into concentration. Her careless attitude vanished as she realized the boy wasn't floundering. He wasn't lost in the sea of pawns and knights. He was building something, weaving a strategy invisible to the untrained eye. She frowned when her knight was taken, her hand tightening on the armrest of her chair. Her friends exchanged brief glances, the unease beginning to spread through the room like a quiet draft. From her place against the wall, Rosa stood frozen, her heart pounding with every movement her son made. She had seen him play countless times at their kitchen table, eyes glowing in the dim light of their apartment, but here in this house where dignity was always stripped away, his talent felt dangerous. She clasped her hands together, pressing them against her chest, willing him to be careful, willing the game to end before it turned into something more than just chess. But Malik didn't flinch. He saw the cracks forming in his opponent's strategy, the gap she left behind because she underestimated him. He moved his queen with quiet authority, sliding it across the board until it stood face to face with her king. "Check," he whispered, his voice barely audible but sharp enough to slice through the silence. The word hung heavy in the air. The millionaire stiffened, her cheeks tinned red as though struck by something she couldn't name. Her friends no longer smiled, their laughter was gone, their amusement turning into an uncomfortable awareness that the joke was unraveling. The boy they expected to crumble was dismantling her moves with precision, stripping away the illusion of her superiority one square at a time. Each captured piece felt louder than the last, echoing in the stillness of the grand room, a rhythm of defiance they hadn't prepared to hear. The game stretched on longer than anyone had expected. What had begun as a light-hearted spectacle now carried a weight that pressed into every corner of the room. Malik's face remained steady, his small hands moving with a confidence that no one had imagined he possessed. Each piece he advanced was deliberate, purposeful, as though he could already see the ending written out far ahead of them. Across the table, the millionaire leaned in closer, her wine glass forgotten, her posture no longer relaxed. Her smile had long vanished, replaced by a tight line of concentration and disbelief. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their once playful commentary reduced to silence. A few whispered, trying to mask their unease, but the tension was unmistakable. Every capture Malik made felt like an unspoken rebuke, every calculated move a reminder that this boy, whom they had reduced to a prop for their amusement, was dismantling their expectations in front of their eyes. The sound of pieces clicking against the board echoed louder than the chatter had moments before, a rhythm that no one dared interrupt. The millionaire's frustration grew with each passing turn. Her fingers tapped against the table as if trying to summon a strategy that had slipped from her grasp. She made her moves quickly now, almost impulsively, as if speed could disguise the cracks in her defense. Malik remained patient, his gaze never faltering, his movements precise. He wasn't rushing. He was sculpting the end of the game, letting it reveal itself piece by piece, just as he had done in the quiet of his home when no one was watching. When his rook slid across the board, pinning her king into a corner, a collective gasp broke through the room. Eyes darted between the board and the millionaire's flushed face. She reached for a piece, hesitated, then dropped it back down with a clatter that betrayed her unraveling composure. Malik lifted his head slightly, his voice steady, soft, but unshakable. Checkmate. The words settled over the room like a stone thrown into still water. The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter could have been. The friends who had come to witness a spectacle looked away, their amusement soared into discomfort. A few forced chuckles tried to rise, but they faltered, hollow and weak. The millionaire's jaw tightened as she slammed a captured piece back onto the board, muttering about luck. Her pride straining against the undeniable truth displayed in front of everyone that night. The walk home was wrapped in silence. The city lights flickered against cracked sidewalks, and the sound of their footsteps was the only rhythm breaking the air. Malik held his backpack tight against his chest, his mind replaying every move of the game as if the pieces were still in motion. He glanced at his mother's face, searching for pride, but what he saw instead was something heavier, worry carved deep into her eyes. She squeezed his hand as if anchoring him to the ground, as if she feared the night itself might swallow him whole. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, uncertain. "Did I do something wrong, Mama?" The question lingered, fragile, carrying the weight of his need for reassurance. Rosa's heart clenched. She had wanted to cheer when he whispered checkmate, to shout to the world that her son's brilliance was undeniable, but the mansion was not a place where victories like his were safe. She had seen too much, felt too much, to believe that genius alone could shield them from consequences. The next morning, the shift was clear in the mansion. The air carried whispers that weren't meant for her ears, but were sharp enough to cut all the same. Conversations paused when she entered, eyes slid away, and tasks that had once been hers were reassigned without explanation. Her hours shrank, her presence treated like an inconvenience rather than a necessity. No one mentioned the game, but its shadow stretched across every room. She cleaned every corner she touched. For Malik, the silence that followed was confusing. There were no invitations to play again, no acknowledgement of what he had proven. It was as if the game had been erased, buried under the weight of wealth and pride. Yet inside him, something had shifted. He had felt power in that moment, a quiet fire that could not be extinguished. He had looked into the eyes of people who expected nothing from him and shown them something they could not ignore, no matter how desperately they tried to pretend otherwise. As days passed, Rosa carried the burden of fear while Malik carried the spark of possibility. He began to see himself differently, no longer as a boy trailing behind his mother's wary footsteps, but as someone capable of shaping the board, of turning silence into strength. The memory of that night became his secret weapon, a reminder that brilliance, once revealed, could never be fully contained. That game of chess was never just about kings and pawns. It was about power, about a system that laughs at the poor, belittles the marginalized, and believes genius belongs only to the privileged. Malik exposed something deeper than strategy. He revealed how fragile arrogance is when confronted with truth. His mother paid the price, as so many do when dignity collides with injustice. But Malik carried forward a lesson the wealthy woman could never buy, that brilliance is not bound by skin color, by class, or by the uniforms our parents wear. It grows in silence and struggle, in the cracks where society refuses to look. One game changed everything. For Rosa, it was the painful cost of survival. For Malik, it was the beginning of a fire that would only burn brighter. And for everyone watching, it was a reminder that cruelty can never silence genius, that no matter how small they want you to feel, your worth can still shake the foundations of their world.